Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Get Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I am here in the studio with my friend Prue Oswin. And Prue, I think you were person number 3 on my community group for Get Around Caboolture. We've been connecting on the professional social media platform, doing stuff. So we were at the e-scooter inquiry the other day at the same table, and you answered my question, which was super amazing and fantastic because I didn't understand the question. I really appreciate having this opportunity to have you here on the show. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. Prue, whereabouts are you and what made you interested in this whole area?
I am based in Caloundra on the Sunshine Coast, so about an hour away from Caboolture if you are on a bus and a train. What made me interested in this area? I don't know how I would not be interested in this area. My bicycle was one of my first forms of freedom. Then it became my rollerblades, believe it or not. It's just the way I want to get around. It's always the first choice and the car is the last choice for me. So I am someone who has, even at university, I rollerbladed to university some days, rode my bike. And then I also had this other strange life where I became a triathlete and a professional triathlete for a few years. So then I got to experience being one of those funny lycra riders, as we thought of them in my university days. So I've done plenty of riding from place to place and lots of riding around in circles, and just very interested in how we can make our communities safer and easier for people to walk and ride around.
I did not know that about you, Prue. So what's the difference between riding in lycra in that competitive vibe and riding around with a cargo e-bike, because you have that, and riding around with kids?
Oh, there are so many differences. I think the most interesting thing when I look back on these different riding identities, the riding around for university as a young person, then the riding around in circles in lycra for very long distances over hills, and the freedom and the amazing feeling that that gives you, and then riding with kids. The most interesting thing is that when I started planning active transport, I used to think I had a reasonable understanding of the needs of bike riders because I had been a commuter rider. This was always my first form of transport, and I had also been in those pelotons where you're riding to try and have these amazing experiences. But what was really interesting is that I did not realize what a gap I had in my knowledge because I did not have the experience of riding with children, caring for children, even looking after my own safety. As a mother, once I had children, I couldn't risk my life anymore, so there was no way I was going to go out on a 100-kilometre-an-hour road when I had children to come home and breastfeed who were relying on me to keep them safe. So yeah, I think that's the most interesting things of those different riding identities, and making sure if I had my time again, I hope that I would be more aware that this is a massive gap in my knowledge base and my experience, and I need to talk to others in short to plan for those years as well.
So you do, is it traffic engineering or transport planning? I don't know, because you do things with speed cushions and you do things with pedestrian crossings and the Raised Crossing Society of Australia and New Zealand. You do these trafficy things. Perhaps you could speak about what is your job, because I actually don't think I know.
Well, I do these trafficy things. I think that sounds very good. A few years ago, it was interesting when I was in my interview to become a registered professional engineer. So you have to go through this long process to be certified. In that process, all of my case studies were about active transport and walking and cycling infrastructure, and I had to tick off on all these different areas to show that I was competent. I really thought I'd done a great job of selling it to these people who I don't think any of them had worked on a project worth less than 200 million in a couple of decades. Like, they were really doing big stuff. So what I explained was my knowledge base is it's everything in active transport, from planning right down to what goes on the ground. And in this specialist area, I feel like I need to be able to hold that line from before the idea of what's needed in a community is even understood, to what goes on the ground to solve that problem. And that's the benefit of being a specialist, that you can be broad in terms of the life of a project before it even exists and it's just an idea in people's minds, through to what gets on the ground. It's been very useful for me because I can talk about what we can end up with, and it is something tangible where we go, okay, that barrier, that part of the network has been solved. So just going back to the engineers thing, in that interview at the end they said, oh, maybe you could do some signs and lines or something. I hadn't really sold it to them that there was a profession here, and it took me a few years to gain confidence that there actually was. There is plenty of work to do in this area, and I think a lot of the projects that we do in active transport, we try to solve them as a big major change, but actually you really need to know the networks in really fine detail to address the barriers that communities have, as if you were a community member or by engaging with the community members. So I try to cover that whole base, so planning through to what ends up on the ground.
Since I've known you in the past 3 years, what projects have you been working on? What's been the outcome of that? What have you learned from doing all those?
So I've worked on a lot of projects. There's been a couple of different key elements of my work. Some have been on principal cycle network projects, guiding that whole process to develop some of our arterial cycling routes. The other side of my work, I've done a lot of work on school studies. The first time I did a school study was about 10 years ago. So I've done a lot of school studies over the years, but when we first started doing them, we were using these theoretical models to try to identify where communities needed infrastructure. And I didn't think the outcomes were very good. So a few years ago, I asked the project manager and said, can we engage with the community? We were usually on a tight time frame and we had enough time this time, so she let me. And so we did our first community survey of a school, of the parents and carers at the school, to find out where they needed infrastructure. We did spatial survey so that they could put points on the maps. And we asked really specific questions about where they needed safer infrastructure. We also asked them about how they felt about the infrastructure we were providing. This study really changed how I thought about active transport. The first finding that we had from that study is the school said to me, normally when we do a survey, we get 3 responses and it's the same 3 parents. And this time they got 110 responses from a school of about 400 people. And so I'm based at the Sunshine Coast, and the Sunshine Coast, when you try to engage with people about walking and cycling and active transport, often there's not a lot of responses that come in. It's not like we've got really large bicycle user groups, lots and lots of people commuting, because we've got low density land use and people going to lots of different places. So that was really interesting. I'm like, we've just put one survey out in one school and we've got 110 responses. And then when the data came in, we'd ask them where they need safer crossings, and it was incredibly compelling. Each person could put up to 10 spots on the map for where they needed these safer crossings. So you might expect a snowstorm across this town in terms of everybody just thinking about themselves, but actually there were about 10, maybe 12 sites in the entire town that they identified where they needed these safer crossings. As an engineer, it took me back to my lectures where we think about simplifying the problem, and they'd simplified the problem for us. Suddenly we didn't have this huge complex kind of mesh of a network to say, what do we do where? They told us about 10 sites where if you fix these sites, we can actually get across town. The other thing that came out in that survey, we asked them about different types of crossings. So I'm not sure if you're aware of what a refuge crossing is. So it's a little island in the middle of the road that we put. In most countries, my understanding is that they might use it as a median, but they also put a zebra crossing as well, or something to give the people priority. Whereas here, we just put these little islands in the middle of the road and we say, okay, off you go now. 10, 12-year-old, you can jump between the cars there. I used to wonder whether I was becoming a bit of a helicopter or overprotective parent when I was really concerned about my children using these kind of crossings. Even when I was with them, they felt unsafe and horrible. But when I got the survey results back, and one of the questions we asked was, how do you feel about these types of crossings? And for refuge crossings, we found that 90% of people were very concerned or somewhat concerned about using them. The refuge crossings that actually identified on the map were compliant. I went out there and I had a look at them. I'm like, but these comply with engineering standards, but they didn't meet the needs of our users. And then when you think back and you think of all the times you've heard people say, oh, parents won't let their kids walk or ride to school, as if they're being helicopter parents or something, instead of saying, actually, the infrastructure we're providing is not meeting their needs. And actually, if you run that through a safe system lens and the best practice road safety principles, it also doesn't comply with what we're trying to do. If a child makes a mistake there, they're likely to be killed or seriously injured, and the parents are very much picking up on that. The first results of this study were really compelling. They showed us we need to do different treatments. parents can help simplify the problem, and also these interventions compared to some of the other projects I was working on. Low cost, much easier to do. You don't need much additional space to put these treatments in. The solutions didn't require us to put kilometres of bikeway in and take away parking and some of the more challenging things. It was more about a point solution that would get people across that busy part of the network. Anyway, that's been another important part of my work.
That's where you started, and then recently I saw a map you did, I think last year, where you put in 4 crossings or 3 crossings, and that changed the number of kids who could ride to school by a huge amount.
Yeah, that was interesting. We've done about 5 of these projects at the Sunshine Coast now, and I've done some in New South Wales as well, but I think the project you're talking about is Talara. At that primary school, there are a number of sites that the parents identified. They had great suggestions. There was a zebra crossing, which we all know is not compliant with our safe system principles. They don't slow cars down. And I had one parent put a comment in the open-ended section of the survey saying, I like this crossing, but it needs some of those little bumps on the road to slow the vehicles down, which was the low-cost engineering treatment that we did. So yeah, what we did there was a number of the sites, the crossings were improved, and based on that study and a number of previous studies, we had a definition of what a safe route to school was that met the parents' needs in terms of what they consider a safe route to school. So that definition is something like the children are separated from vehicle traffic and they have priority at crossings, and the vehicles are slowed down at crossings, and priority at crossings at all but the kind of lowest, quieter streets really. So what we did to create that route to school was we treated the side road crossings, which in every single survey has come up as an area of concern, and we also treated the mid-block crossings. And what we found is we could extend the safe route to school from about 50 metres, because the first side road was only 50 or 100 metres away from the school, and that was the first kind of danger point that people weren't comfortable with, up to I think it was 1.6 kilometres. And so you go from having 10 houses within a safe route to school to 100 or so houses.
So you've done that project, and then I saw you came out with a brochure of speed cushions. It's on my website actually. I thought, oh, it's super simple, super cheap for councils to do. It's like no effort, but it's great to just have it there and go, it doesn't need to be high, big stuff. I think because transport departments deal with lots and lots of expensive stuff, they can undervalue cheap stuff thinking, well, it doesn't make any difference. And I think there's a real misalignment if you're so used to dealing with millions and billions of dollars to go, 10 grand is going to be able to make you do this, 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 this.
Yeah, I think if we go back, remember those first principles, and these are what I define as a good active transport investment in terms of protecting people from harm, feasible and cost effective, and responding to community needs. So every time I'm looking at a project, and whenever a site pops up on one of the maps that the community's identified that they need, that's the filter I take it through. It needs to comply with all of those things. And the feasible and cost effective, there's lots of pressure, and I'm always rethinking this stuff as well to try and create these perfect projects and ideal scenarios. And I would be comfortable doing that if we had a network that was 80% effective for active transport and we were just trying to pinch together the last 20% or something like that. But we're not. We've got a network that might be 80% deficient in terms of people are so restricted in their movements. Every time I do a project, normally we've got 10 or 12 sites. Now they might be $100,000. Some of them are usually a $5 million project in there or something really complicated because we've constructed some enormous roads without the crossing facilities to do it. So there's always this tension between build it perfect or what's the lowest cost treatment you can do. And personally, I think that we can make these perfect projects, but I'm really trying to keep people alive. That's the biggest barrier that people face. And it's not just that, it's also the fear they experience every day at a dangerous environment. You know, if they are that person who's determined to walk their children to school in an environment that's not perfect, they experience fear, stress. It's a part of their life. My children are going to be grown up and I'm still going to be worried about them crossing the road near my house because it's so dangerous. That's anxiety that people have all of the time. So personally, I think we should be looking at these low-cost solutions wherever we can. That's my individual bias because I know how efficient our network is and I want to see the money go as far as it can.
I mean, that's just good budgeting, good cost-effective stuff. It's interesting you talk about road safety. So this morning I cycled down to Morayfield. I have 2 of those swimming noodles that go across my bike because drivers drive so closely because there's this false idea that bicycles aren't allowed on the road because we don't pay for registration. So there's a lot of aggression in that space, and it's wrong and all the rest, but nonetheless, I'm on a smaller vehicle and they're in a big ute and they're driving past really aggressively. And then I arrived at this pedestrian bridge, and a woman, she was screaming at me for going really unsafe because I've got these noodles and I'm so unsafe with my noodles. I just thought, you kind of can't ever get it right.
I think that can be a situation where you always feel like you're in the wrong, particularly when you're riding a bike. And I find that particularly now that I've got children who are getting a little bit older, so around 11, and people are very quick with boys who are 11 to blame them no matter what's going on. I'm doing my best to train them in path etiquette, slowing down, giving them lots of space and doing things, but at the same time, people just behave poorly to each other. What I try to do is influence the things that we can control, and I think a lot in active transport we can bring it big and turn it into these wicked problems that we can't solve. And I did a presentation on that a couple of years ago in terms of countering that and saying, I don't think we need to keep going bigger all the time. There are all these problems we can solve if we go back to concentrating on the things we can influence. I think with path user safety, we heard lots at the inquiry the other day about the necessity to separate people walking from people cycling, and that is definitely the case, but it's not always the case. And I think this is where it's really important for us to look carefully at the problems. And we talked before about how all the way from planning down to a speed cushion, that's kind of where I cover in active transport, because you do need to understand it in that detail. A lot of the conflicts we have on paths, we're not providing any structure for people to understand that we've got people of different speeds using these paths, that they might pose a risk to each other. When I was working on a guideline for fencing and edging treatments, I spent lots of time observing how path users interact on paths, and my kids were quite young at the time. It was really interesting, and we have really strict requirements about fencing, and sometimes we were over sensitive to that issue. But when you put a centre line on a path, people behave differently. And what I noticed is even on very crowded and busy paths, you put a centre line on and people take the pathing manoeuvre seriously. They slow down and they actually wait until the other side of the path is free before they cross that centre line and go across. So it's something we can do to make our shared paths in Queensland more self-explaining. We're trying to have it all. We kind of think that if we don't put a centre line down, everybody's going to ride really slowly, but that's not what happens. They're riding at speeds of 30 kilometres an hour. Sometimes what I notice with friends when I'm running with them, they're not expecting when they get to an intersection with another path that an e-scooter might be coming along at 25 or 30 k's an hour. And if you put a centre line down, then it does become more self-explaining, and that's something that's more obvious. And I noticed that when my son was about 3, he would respond to that as well. I think we need to use our engineering to provide the structure to make the most of the facilities we've got. That's one of the kind of engineering interventions that we can do to help support things like that as well.
So with the school crossing Talara, I think you put in 3 crossings in one place.
All up, we put in 5 crossings. 3 of them were heading in one direction and the other one was heading in the other direction. So 4 of the crossings worked together to service different areas in a catchment. And I think from recollection, we had 150 metres of safe route to school before people got to that first side road crossing. And then we extended that to 1.6 kilometres to school, because what we do then is once you've got that 1.6 kilometres, you tie into a very low volume street. And at that point, it doesn't matter that there's no pathway because it's very low volume, pretty low speed, and they're in the local street, so it's pretty safe. Now, this is where we're assuming that most people are comfortable for the kids from that point on, once we've got those crossings and footpaths in.
And so how many kids, what was the difference?
Now, that project, the way that Sunshine Coast Council does it, and they've been doing this for a number of years now, it's a fantastic program. So there's 2 things that go together. The first thing they do is the infrastructure program to improve the infrastructure where the parents need it. That always starts with a school survey to find out what the barriers are. And the second element of that is the Ride Score program. Now, the Ride Score program has beacons on the kids' bikes, and so then the parents get an alert when their child has made it to school. It also incentivises the riding to school as well. So combined with the 2 programs, they had a 55% increase in the total number of riding trips to school with this program.
Did you see a difference in the school drop-off and collection? Did that make a difference in the traffic at the school gate by chance?
I don't think it's recorded. I can't speak to that. The metrics that we can get access to, and it's always difficult to get the data to support what we're doing, but the metrics is on Sunshine Coast Council's webpage, and they talk about how many kilometres that children at the Ride Score schools have ridden. And it's hundreds of thousands of kilometres. It's extraordinary looking at what these kids have done. And I think one of the interesting things is if you look at the main cycling cohort in Australia, or if you look at the National Cycling Participation Survey, the main cohort is kids. Like, they are our champions of active travel, and we should be acknowledging that in our planning to the contribution they're making. What is good is that some people now have options, and I've done a number of surveys now, and it's really interesting because in every survey it comes out that people want their children to be able to walk and ride to school, and road safety is the main barrier. So there is definitely that willingness there, and that's where I see that I have a skill set, and my job is to address those barriers so we can make it possible for as many kids and families as possible.
Say somebody in a transport department is listening to this, whether they're state or council, and they think, that's really interesting because it seems like the school drop-off, which nobody likes. The kids don't like it, the parents don't like it, the schools don't like it, the councils don't like it, the state government doesn't like it. So say somebody's going, all right, we really need to change the school drop-off situation. What would you suggest is, give me some ideas.
For active transport, I think, especially in outer suburb areas, it is something that's solvable. It is something that we can invest in now, and it's something that we can get relatively quick wins in. So I've done 5 school surveys now in the Sunshine Coast region. Every one of those projects has been followed by infrastructure investments, crossings and footpaths, often built within the first 6 to 12 months after the study's been done. Now, that's pretty extraordinary in the life of civil engineering projects, but we get such good data from the parents. For one, I call them super engagers schools because they have these amazing communication channels. When we are doing a school project, we give the school everything they need to engage with their parents. Nobody has pushed back on that yet, and they share that information, and then that community tells us where they need infrastructure. So when you have such good, precise knowledge about where investment is needed to address the barriers, then you can act on it, and it provides the evidence and the data to get funding to do that. Funding infrastructure around schools, I think, is a no-brainer. I don't know why we're not focusing more heavily in investing in this kind of infrastructure. After the first couple of studies I did, my rough thoughts was about, and it will sound a lot to people, but in the infrastructure world it's not as much, but $2 million for school if we were focusing on allocating that for infrastructure improvements to update the network to make it suitable for the larger number of vehicles we have to get kids to school, then we could do a decent job of addressing the main barriers to our schools. I think one of the other things we need to consider is that we all look to the Netherlands as the model. This is what we want. We want cycling here, there and everywhere. But the Netherlands started with the Stop Child Murder campaign. They started with the mothers saying, we need to create infrastructure that supports these safe routes to school. We have exactly the same problem, not exactly the same because we have choices now. So people are putting their children in cars because it's not safe enough for them to walk or ride. But every school I've asked, they want them to walk or ride. Often it's just not one trip for a parent to get a child to school, it's 2. So we actually replace 2 vehicle trips with 1 active transport trip. I think it's good investment. It's popular projects as well. We see a lot of our transport investments dominated by what people want. And when we engage with schools about these issues, we're quite strategic about it. We're investing in safe and sustainable transport. So what we are prepared to invest in terms of making the community better, making the transport system more effective and efficient. All of these active transport projects are contributing to that. But we don't ask questions about where do you need more parking. We don't ask questions about where do you need road upgrades. We just direct people towards where do you need these safer crossings. And after we've done all that, in the open-ended question at the end, we still get some comments about parking or traffic or bad driver behaviour, but it's not the focus. And I think if we do want to make active transport an option for people, then we really need to be engaging with communities to find out what they need and how we can do that, because popular projects get money, and these are really popular projects. You want us to address congestion at schools, so do all the parents. One of the sites interesting finding that has come up when we ask where kids are going to after school, because they're not just going home, they've got really complicated after school activities and things, and we need to be looking at the high school, the sports fields and the aquatic centre, that they are really strong active transport links. That should be your active transport highways in a town. If you look at a regional town, your biggest cohort of bike riders are going to be your children and they're all the places they go, you know. So things like that we can do to really improve the networks around not just the school to home, but school to those other key facilities as well.
And also to shopping centres, because often they've got a part-time job at one of the fast food places or hanging out at the mall or whatever. And then once you do that, then you can have people with disabilities or people like me.
Connections to bus stops as well. There was one community that we did a school study in, and then afterwards I was doing some work for a developer who was planning major infrastructure improvements to service the town associated with this new development, and we engaged with a lot of older people in the town around that. What we found was that a lot of the issues they were identifying were similar to the school children. They were dependent on public transport. There was one lady who said she lived opposite the shopping centre but had to drive there because she couldn't cross the road there. I describe that road as like a shooting gallery in the middle of town. Like, it's just so many vehicles coming across, and it's been going on for decades. Every year it gets a little bit busier. At some point in time, that amount of traffic on that road gets to a point where people don't feel safe crossing it. What I found is at that point, often we build one of these little refuges in the middle of the road that 90% of the community is somewhat concerned or very concerned about using. I was looking up and I said, okay, how high do I have to build a wall for 90% of the community to not be able to go over it? And the height was about 1.6 metres. Then 85% of your community couldn't get over it. If you imagine one of these roads, it's like your crossing is like you've put a 1.6 metre wall there, and that's what you're asking people to go over it. Only a fraction of your population are comfortable to use it. And that means that you've got basically this 1.6 metre high wall right through your town. And in this town, the shopping centre's on one side and the school's on the other side, and half the people are on each side. We really need better ways of understanding just how significant these barriers of busy roads are.
So we're up to that point in the program where I say, if somebody's in the community, and I talk about either my friend who has two small kids, one has just started school and the other one is still around at home a lot. So maybe one thing for her, and then one of our big listeners is a guy with a disability. What are the things that they can do?
The first thing they can do is they can identify sites that they need, and they can write to their council to address those issues. I think anybody who has the inclination and time to write, it is just about sending an email and saying what you want. And it's really important that that data is submitted so that council has a record of that. And one day it might get built. Talking from the other side, I guess what I'm more interested in, and I see lots of these kind of requests from people who say, I have a problem, I can't get my children to school. So many mothers have said to me when I tell them what they do, and then they talk about their kids walking or riding to school, and one mum said, oh, he really wants to, but I won't let him because of this. And I always ask them about the specific crossing and validate their concerns. I'm like, yes, it is unsafe. You can go with your judgment. Children do get killed here. If you're not comfortable, write to your council, ask for a crossing there. But I think the most important thing is on the other side of the fence in these agencies. These roads are getting busier and busier. And what we need to do is we need to be systematic about the way we track, record and address these barriers. So in most regions, when we have potholes, we track how many potholes we're having recorded and how many we're fixing. We need to be doing that with crossings. It's a key metric for transport planning. When our roads get busier, at some point they become impassable. It's like that wall is just growing till it gets to 1.6 metres when you've got about 10,000 vehicles a day. It's a wall. We need that metric so that we can understand when we need to start building these crossings to protect people and keep them safe. So we need state government funding programs for crossings. We need to have systems and processes to record this and how long it's taking us to address those complaints that people in the community are making and asking. It's good data.
It reminds me of a program where in the US, it was the director of the bus company, and she put out a survey to the general community and said, what would make it easier for you? And people wrote in, and she just said, okay, well, let's fix it. And so every time somebody wrote in, they said, I just want a ramp, I want some shade, I want a bench, I want a crossing, I want signage, all of these things. And she did it. Everybody was so much happy. And it was really cheap things. People are actually surprisingly humble. I think when you are on active transport and you're riding your bike and your scooter and you're walking, you don't want expensive things a lot of the time. For some reason, it's like, well, if it's one person, it's not important, not seeing that one person is actually a whole lot of people who haven't complained.
It's both. It's the cheap ones and it's the difficult ones, depending on the area. Often when you see problems, they've been around for years because it is a tricky problem. And this is, again, having to go back to the not building it perfect. A few years ago, I did this training course that was safe system assessments. And I felt after I did that course, it just taught me how I could compromise on standards without putting people at risk. And what it used to feel like is when I couldn't comply with a standard, it's just like I'd fallen in a pit and I couldn't get myself out. And I really wanted to solve a problem, but there was no solution. I couldn't build it wider, I couldn't build it taller. There was just nothing there. And then when you have these kind of contemporary road safety strategies, which is more about making the best of you can and keeping people safe, then you've got options. So it's something that I felt like I almost became competent as an engineer overnight when I learned how to compromise on solutions to get a solution in that would address people's problem, even though it wasn't perfect. So I love that we have processes like that endorsed by Austroads now. It gives us so many more tools to fix these tricky parts in the networks that we didn't used to be able to fix sometimes.
Well, it's been super great having this chat. I've loved it. It's great to chat with you about it because we meet from time to time, but I don't think we ever really have a big chat like this. And there's so much more that I want to ask, but we've run out of time. Before I close out, is there anything else you would like to add? Closing remarks, final thoughts, anything you wish I should have asked that I didn't?
I do want to thank you for what you're doing here. I think the contribution you make, the bringing knowledge, practitioners, community members together is amazing. I have done a little bit of advocacy and in my own community, it is the hardest thing I've ever done. Yeah, I just thank you for your amazing efforts and your professionalism. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Thank you. I actually think advocacy is much easier than I expected because I had heard it's really hard. What I realized the other day is if I write 20 letters, it's much easier than writing one to the transport agency going, fix this thing, where I go, oh, I'm going to get a negative response. So if I write 20 letters to 20 different people trying to solve an issue somewhere, that gives me more inspiration, and that is much easier for me to deal with rather than solving a particular problem that is beyond my skills anyway. See, I'm not an engineer, so I don't know about all the engineering problems.
That is very interesting. I'm going to think about that.
I had a bad experience after a meeting the other day, and I was just so bleak, to be honest, about that. I realized that it's because it's one big, powerful department, whereas if I'm a bit more scattergun, I get a better outcome, and I'm then asking a query. Is this possible? Can we change this? Have I understood this correctly? What are the opportunities here, rather than this is a solution I need you to do? Because if I do that, I'm done for. It's way too depressing, definitely.
Yeah, well, I look forward to this lesson on advocacy because that scattergun approach, I can really see how that could help out because yeah, I certainly have learnt ways that don't work.
And I think your work is fantastic. What I love about your work is you too are doing advocacy in a different way in your own world, which I think is amazing because you're not doing the complicated high-tech stuff. You're just going, what do you want? How can we do it? Can we do it for $1.95 in a lot of instances? And then with this other big thing, which is really difficult, what we can do is we can write to, say, the federal or the state government and say, we can't fix this on our own, but we have put into place this, and this is the last point. And that shows willing and good in a grant application. You know, who doesn't want to give money to somebody who's already tried to solve a lot of problems already?
So I guess there's a little bit of scattergun going on there as well.
Exactly. All right. Well, thanks so much, Prue. Fantastic to have you on the show.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out getaroundcaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.